Series. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Whit Stewart, the Assistant Professor and Extension Sheep Specialist at the University of Wyoming. I am Carolyn Eady, the Ag Educator for Crawford and Richland counties. With me tonight is Lissa Seefeld, the Ag Extension Educator in Eau Claire County, Ashley Olson, the Ag Educator for Vernon County, Bernie O'Rourke, the Youth Extension Livestock Specialist, thank you. I'll do that again, everybody. Sorry about that. So greetings, welcome to our presentation tonight. We are going to hear from Dr. Whit Stewart, the Assistant Professor and Extension Sheep Specialist at the University of Wyoming. Sorry, we're going to get our W's messed up tonight. I am Carolyn Eady, the Ag Educator for Crawford and Richland counties. With me tonight is Lissa Seefeld, the Ag Educator from Eau Claire County, Ashley Olson, the Ag Educator for Vernon County, and Bernie O'Rourke, the Youth Extension Specialist, Todd Taylor, University of Wisconsin Sheep Unit. Please feel free to reach out to us in the chat if you have any questions. We are glad that you could join us, and if you joined us early and you saw the screens going by about how to use Zoom, please remember the most important functions, your microphone, and you can keep that off. And then later tonight, after the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions, and you can open that up. Your chat, that's how we're going to communicate with each other, so you can go ahead and write your questions or comments in the chat. Please place any questions or comment in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that during the presentation, and we'll review any of the items of great interest at the end. Lissa, you want to go ahead with the poll, please? Right now, you'll be seeing a poll, and it's just letting us gather some information about you and your production. Thank you for taking our poll. Todd, would you like to do our introductions, please?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
Oh, hang on. I got to get things figured out here too. So with us tonight, it's a pleasure to have a fellow cowboy alum. Well, I shouldn't say alum. He's a cowboy professor or employee currently. I'm the alumnus, I guess, the University of Wyoming, but it's a joy to have Whit with us. Whit is an Eastern fellow by growing up, but moved west and did all of his educational work out there from Brigham Young University in Idaho. Is that correct, Whit? Is that what I understand? Is your undergrad was there? Received his master's at Oregon State. Spent some time at New Mexico State working on his PhD before he kind of traveled around the West, worked some as an extension agent in Wyoming, some at New Mexico State, spent a few years as the extension educator and in charge of a lot of the sheep program in Montana State before coming most recently to the University of Wyoming. And I think Whit's forte is ruminant nutrition, and it seems like he specializes a lot in minerals and even some micro minerals. I know he's currently been doing a lot of work on zinc. One of the neatest things, I think one of the things that Whit prides himself on is his ability to educate students both at the undergraduate level and the graduate level and keep them engaged and interested in sheep production. I know just recently he's turned out, just in the last couple of years, he's turned out at least 2 or 3 new extension specialists in the Western US that are really starting to have an impact on our industry. He's young and vibrant and really turned out some young and vibrant students that I think are going to help our industry out tremendously. So with that, I welcome Dr. Whit Stewart from University of Wyoming to our program tonight, and we'll turn it over to him and let him talk a little bit about mineral and cost-effective mineral balancing. You can type some questions as we go along in the chat box. If it's something that one of us on the panel maybe can't give you a little insight on, we'll interrupt Whit and see if he can answer it before we lose those questions. But otherwise, we'll try to roll through these and leave some time for questions at the end. Whit?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Todd, for that introduction. And thank you, Carolyn, Lisa, Ashley, and Bernie for having me. I think it's an honor to be able to address you from a University of Wisconsin platform. I admire a lot of the sheep folks that have come out of that state. Dr. Thomas, Dr. Murphy, Cody, Todd, working up there. So this is an honor for me today. Can you see my slides? All right.
Yes, we can, Whit. Everything looks good.
Excellent. Okay. So as Todd mentioned, I'm here at the University of Wyoming, and here my role plays numerous multifaceted aspects. So I'm the extension specialist. I have a large research appointment. I teach some classes and also coordinate the wool judging team. And so when we start talking about my research emphasis, I finally feel like I'm in my wheelhouse, although I'm sure there will be some questions that will stump me tonight. And I hope that we can keep this as interactive as possible. I always like to preface most of my talks. Do I need to move that ribbon down? Is that obstructing the view up there? Can you see the whole slide, Todd? I'm sorry.
We can see the whole slide. You're good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Zoom seems to be clouding that screen. I'm a big fan of preventing problems. I think most of us are. I think trying to retroactively fix nutritional issues is not something that I have a great track record with. I do have a better track record of preventing nutritional issues. And so I always like this cartoon. It reminds me of some of my other shortcomings when it comes to mechanical maintenance and other DIY type stuff around my family's place. But as we kind of get started and we focus on mineral nutrition today, I'm hoping that I can give some of the why and some of the how. What I don't plan on doing to a huge extent, we could do that in the Q&A, is I don't want to try and troubleshoot all the ration balancing problems that you may have. And this is my one disclaimer, is that there are good nutritionists out there that can help you refine those specific tailored aspects of nutritional management on your operation. Hopefully we can cover enough of those that you feel well equipped to address some of those on your operation. But I really want to talk a little bit start by asking you some rhetorical questions. And this is not my professorial cap that I'm wearing trying to quiz you, but these are things that oftentimes I hear as I take questions throughout the state and region when it comes to trace mineral nutrition and grazing nutrition. So first one is, if a mineral is sufficient or deficient in the soil, will the forage reflect those concentrations? Could mineral shortfalls be limiting your flock production? And we'll talk a little bit about some of the times those are blatantly obvious when it comes to clinical deficiencies, but sometimes there's some subclinical deficiencies that may be limiting our production potential in our operations. Do I prioritize my mineral supplementation during specific times of the year? This is an important one. I hope by the end of today's or this evening's conversation, I can highlight some of those critical production periods where if we fail to keep up with our providing a mineral or making sure that it's the right mineral, I'm hopeful that we can walk away with understanding those more important time points. Could mineral requirements vary by breed and stage of production? Now, this may appear like we're getting lost in the weeds a little bit and getting a little too specific, but we've understood a little bit recently that the requirements that dictate how much an animal needs of a certain mineral, whether it be a macro or micro mineral, will depend on their level of production. And we know the vast diversity that exists within the sheep industry. So there is some nuance there that we're going to talk about. I also hope to challenge you on, do we acknowledge that our forage quality changes throughout the year? I was relieved a little bit to see that over 54% of those tuning in tonight are outside of Wisconsin. I tried to make this talk very applicable to a Great Lakes kind of northern plains or Great Lakes region production system, but there's enough of us on here that I can broaden things out a little bit. And then hopefully we can challenge each other to be more proactive in testing our feeds. So with that in mind, I won't get on a soapbox too much tonight, but I want you to be thinking about those things, those questions. Just a bit of housekeeping. When we start talking about mineral nutrition, broadly we categorize macro and micro minerals into those two categories. Macro minerals are required in greater quantities physiologically by the animal. They're expressed as a percent of the diet or oftentimes in grams. Micro minerals, in contrast, are those expressed in milligrams per kilogram or parts per million in much smaller quantities, but nevertheless very important. I'm going to come back to this and talk about this a little bit more, but that kind of gets us all on the same page as I talk about macro and micro minerals. So now I get to ask a question, okay? And this is, we're going to set up another poll here for you. In the past 5 years, have you ever experienced a mineral deficiency in your ewe flock? Okay. Such as, and I use white muscle disease because that's very commonly known. There could be phosphorus deficiency issues. There can be some cobalt deficiency issues, but have you identified one of those deficiencies in your flock? Okay. So as these results come in, it's either yes, no, or maybe, I'm just not sure. And that's okay. So roughly about half of us, it looks like, as these answers trickle in, it looks about half of us can say no. And I would challenge you to say, if we are not seeing those deficiencies, good for you. You're on top of your nutrition. And I don't expect them to be overtly widespread from a clinical standpoint or what we would consider a wreck. About a quarter of us are uncertain and a quarter of us say yes. So hopefully as we talk about some of those production losses, I'm hopeful that we can understand a little bit better. Let me see how I can close that up. Oh. Okay, the poll seems to be blocking out my slide. There we go. So oftentimes I think it's important to understand where we may be seeing those losses, if at all. And so we categorize those broadly into subclinical deficiencies, or those that are hard for us to visually identify or identify, you know, in a production loss that's very easy to quantify, right? Those clinical deficiencies, when an animal goes down, or morbidity, mortality, complete loss of appetite, those are blatant. But I challenge us to think a little bit more broadly where we might be seeing some losses that are harder for us to quantify. You know, sometimes, especially here in the West, with drought cycles, fluctuating weaning weights are just the nature of the business in the Western sheep industry. But in some of our environments, we can attribute that to the nutritional quality in it in and year out. It may be greater open ewes or dry ewes. It may be delayed conception, where your lambing season is more strung out than it normally has been. Lamb vigor issues. And one that's really hard that I can probably with certainty say many of us are not quantifying is vaccination response, okay? And colostrum quality. All of these subclinical manifestations of a mineral deficiency may be occurring in our flocks at any given time. I talk a little bit about microminerals, and as I alluded to earlier, they're required in smaller amounts, but their purpose is really critical. They serve as cofactors, or basically they're a link in the chain that allows larger processes to happen in the animal. And I'll just use a couple of examples here. Cobalt, for example. Now, an animal doesn't necessarily have a cobalt requirement, but it does have a vitamin B12 requirement, and it requires cobalt to produce that vitamin B12. Without that vitamin B12, rumen fermentation in the most efficient way possible, which is propionate production, would not happen. We don't look at those volatile fatty acids in the rumen or those fermentation byproducts, but what we do characterize as growth performance. Without cobalt, all those intermediate steps don't happen. Similarly, when we're looking at lamb survival and lamb vigor, again, cobalt is not explicitly required in the diet. We provide it so that it produces vitamin B12. And all those things that we measure in a husbandry standpoint are on a real on the farm gate: lamb birth weights, growth, vigor, survival to weaning. Those are all results of a very small amount of a trace mineral requirement. Now, one that we're all very familiar with, and that I'm pretty familiar with from some of my master's work at Oregon State University, is selenium, okay? It's a potent antioxidant. It protects cells from free radical damage. Now, we don't think about that a whole lot when we think about the manifestation of white muscle disease or a clinical selenium and vitamin E issue. What we see and what we measure is those images there at the bottom of the page, okay? Real recumbency to stand, issues standing, very arthritic in appearance. That is what we recognize. But again, really a small quantity of these trace minerals are required, but exert a tremendous effect from a biological function standpoint. What about those subclinical selenium deficiencies? And again, I'm using selenium and I'll use zinc and cobalt just as an example to get us thinking a little bit more about some of the other minerals, okay? All of these things have been reported as a result of what we would consider a subclinical selenium deficiency. The animals aren't laying on the ground, recumbent, flailing their legs. These are real production measures that have been documented as a result of animals not being clinically deficient, but having that subclinical deficiency. I think it's important for us to understand that the most important place for us to start when we're looking at how effective our trace mineral program is quantifying what they're getting in the basal diet. I know immediately some of us say, well, I'm going to put out a mineral and that's going to solve the problem. But from a strategic standpoint, understanding what's in the grass at various points of the year, what's in our basal silage diets, or whatever your main dietary component is, that's a very important first step. There's some good work by USDA NOMS done, well, over 20 years ago now, but looked at these forage samples across the country. And this was 23 states were included in this survey to give a broad picture of how much basal hay diets meet some of these trace mineral requirements. And I just include selenium and zinc in this, but you can see that about 70% of those hay and forage samples collected across these states were inadequate to meet selenium requirements. Forage zinc, again, similar story, about 77% were deficient. And so I think it's important for us, and I'll challenge us throughout the course of this webinar, to be thinking about how we can more efficiently test those basal components of our animals' diets and understanding what the trace mineral content is. We did some work up at Montana State University looking at some serum trace mineral status of ram lambs that were being developed as studs or to be sold at larger sale outlets. And what we understood as we did this study, and we bled over 200 rams across 21 operations, and we looked at again, where we could extrapolate where they may or may not be deficient around the time of weaning. And what we saw was really interesting to us. We saw a high proportion of animals were deficient in their selenium, but we also interestingly observed that the majority of those animals that were considered deficient or marginally deficient based off of their blood status very closely correlated those regions of the state that had low selenium levels. This map right here, this color-coded map here of Montana, those areas in blue on the western side of Montana are those that are historically known to be selenium deficient. And so what this led us to hypothesize a little bit better is, one, selenium and zinc, even though I don't show that on this slide, were the main trace minerals of interest where we started to see deficiencies occur. But also the utility of using a geochemistry map to see what's actually in the soil. Now I realize as I updated this slide, now that I know that the majority of folks listening in tonight are not in this region, if you're in the continental United States, the USGS or the geochemistry survey looked at some of these trace mineral concentrations in the soil. And on the map on the left, again, shows those areas in Wisconsin and in the northern Great Lakes region that are deficient in selenium. and those with molybdenum concentrations. And I just use these two as an example. You can pull up this report at the link provided above, and you can zoom in with relatively good accuracy to get a baseline of what your soils have for these trace minerals. I think it's important to recognize that we know historically, based off of lots of diagnostic samples and empirical evidence of operating in our regions, what we have roughly. But I find this map to be very helpful, especially when looking at potential antagonists or minerals that may be excessive, that may be drawing down the absorption of other minerals, such as molybdenum tying up copper. Soil selenium, as you can tell, as you look at this part of Wisconsin, those of you listening from this region, you can see and roughly extrapolate with the resolution that I provide, whether you're sitting on an area that would be considered selenium deficient or not. Again, the blue and the greenish colors indicating areas that are inadequate to grow selenium containing forage. Another important aspect, and you're probably shaking your head saying, I thought this was simple and cost effective. Well, mineral nutrition can be a very nuanced approach to understanding how much to add in the face of other minerals. These mineral interactions are common. We oftentimes really only worry about a handful of those, such as molybdenum antagonizing copper. We also see sulfur levels antagonize copper, and to a lesser extent selenium. But understanding that these interactions exist, and oftentimes, whether it be an interaction from hard water or water that has a high degree of heavy metals, or whether it be forage or feed stuff, it's important to keep an eye that sometimes when we see trace mineral deficiencies, these may be a result of an antagonistic relationship. A lot of work has been done in our neck of the woods in the Western US, as we have a lot of water issues. You could imagine through the drought cycles that we have a high degree of sulfates in our water, total dissolved solids, we have high iron content. And so generally speaking, when our sulfate levels in our water exceed 2,500 to 3,000 milligrams of sulfate per liter, we start to see some of that antagonism occur that manifests in some clinical issues. Again, just talking a little bit more about molybdenum and copper, going back to that survey that we completed in Montana. If you look at that map and focus in on Montana there, you can see that there's a lot of red and orange areas that are molybdenum hotspot areas. Interestingly, there was 2 ranches in this study that we conducted that sat right on top of some of those hotspots. And interestingly, as we observed some of those response in their blood mineral values, we saw that those high areas with molybdenum forages, or those areas that were grazing sheep in high molybdenum zones, had dramatically decreased copper concentrations. We saw some of this manifested in some steely wool. I provide some of this, some images to show that. I know that oftentimes copper, for the majority of our industry, could be a 4-letter word, as copper toxicity is very much a real challenge that we have. But in the Western United States, where we rely on dormant forages and some of these rangelands, copper can actually be deficient. One thing that I hope we're all thinking about a little bit is we understand that the best resource we have from a cost-effective feed ingredient is that standing forage in our operations. It's generally about 33% of the cost of a harvested feed. And so understanding how we can manipulate and manage those forage resources sustainably, especially when we think about trace mineral nutrition, is important. One important aspect that we weren't always aware of, but as we have done more work in our region, mineral element concentrations decline through the growing season. Calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, copper, zinc, manganese, and sodium all decline as that animal reaches dormancy and puts on a seed head, and more nutrients are shuttled to the roots. We recently published a review paper that kind of looked at this internationally to see, obviously across various plant species and other continents, but this shows the percentage change from these various seasons. For example, in the US Pacific Northwest, for calcium, we generally see in some of these cool season grasses an 8% decline from May to December, and so on and so forth for the various columns. What I hope you're able to see here, with some exception, is that as plant quality declines in terms of digestibility and stage, We oftentimes don't always think that minerals also decline, but they do. And that's something to keep an eye on, especially as most of our production systems rely on harvested feed, or they coincide with grazing periods of these dormant grasses when their nutritional value is the lowest, which again, all of us being sheep enthusiasts, is a pretty outstanding merit to think about, that we ask sheep to do the most physiologically, breeding up, maintaining a pregnancy during the most challenging climatic times of the year, and also nutritional. All right, so on to the next polling question. Again, we're still getting through the why, and I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit. So this question, do you improve your mineral supplementation efforts for the stages of production of lambing or lactation? I like what I'm seeing here. And I'm not implying that we change our mineral package this time of the year. Logistically, trying to tailor a mineral for various stages of production isn't necessarily a realistic approach, but there are some things that we can employ. So about 73% of us, or 3/4 of us, say yes, you do, and that's great. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that for the 30% that don't. So I think it's important for us to understand how mineral requirements are calculated. And I don't want to overcomplicate this. I provide this equation and probably your eyes are glazing over. But I think from a very simplistic standpoint, the requirement of a mineral is dependent on their stage of production. Scientists that have developed these requirements in the NRC and have compiled these recommendations and done this research, basically it takes into account all of those aspects that require production. So body size, maintenance of that animal and its tissues, okay, body weight gain if it's an animal that's growing rapidly, wool, and then fetal growth according to pregnancy. This column here on the right gives us a snapshot of some of these different breed types. And I use zinc as an example. Again, I apologize. That's what we've used most recently in most of our research. But take, for example, this first bar graph of a Katahdin. This is data from US Mark. Dr. Tom Murphy was a co-author on this paper, looking at the requirements as they relate to pregnancy, maintenance, and body weight gain. Relatively speaking, Katahdins from 2010 to 2020 had a relatively lower zinc requirement than one sire breed or terminal sire like a Suffolk, okay? You can see that obviously there are some body size or some maintenance requirements that exceed that of the Katahdin when you look at the Suffolk. Also, there's some gain and some fetal size considerations there. So all of these aspects of production add up to that translate to the requirement. What's interesting to me a little bit is you look at the columns that say P, which would be for Polypay, and Ramblay. We kind of did just a brief historical comparison looking at data from the US Sheep Experiment Station and US Mark of these various breeds. And you can see that as our genotypes or as our level of production have changed over time, as we've selected for more prolific sheep, as we selected perhaps for greater fiber growth, you can see these requirements tick up a little bit. And so I think that's an important aspect to understand is, one, how productive are your sheep? And I'm going to ask some questions here a little bit later. Are you a 250% lamb crop type operation, intensively managed? Are you a range flock that's specializing in lamb growth and fiber? Those aspects matter when thinking about how tailored your mineral package is. I alluded to this, and I'm blown away and excited that many of us, or 3/4 of us, do prioritize our mineral supplementation program as we get to those more demanding stages of production. Requirements are highest during breeding, gestation, and lactation. Okay, and that's pretty common for both our macro minerals and our micro minerals. Okay, requirements do increase with age and level of productivity. As we can imagine, we don't expect our highest lamb drop out of our first time lambing ewes, but as those ewes get older, especially into their prime, you can expect that those mineral requirements, again, I'm using zinc as an example from this review paper, in milligrams per day, you can see that 4-year-old ewe has a greater requirement by almost 10 milligrams than that first time lambing ewes. And finally, I think prioritizing our efforts, and I'll give you some ideas to how to do that, and I'm happy to have others share as we get into some of the Q&A, but really prioritizing those efforts for those time points are really critical, and those give us the greatest return in terms of lamb viability and performance. I don't want to bore you with figures, and I know this seems like this is a lecture at a university. I apologize, but again, I just want to highlight, I have these figures put up here that show the relative change from maintenance, breeding, as we go on through gestation and into lactation. Again, these are our macro minerals, so those that are required in greater quantities in the diet. But what you can see is we get into early gestation, we really start to see those requirements tick up. And so think about your production calendar and the time that you provide added supplements, or maybe you're changing byproducts. How closely have you looked at whether those meet those requirements or not? Or do you let the sheep tell you with decreased production? I throw this example up there for calcium and magnesium. Again, just thinking about some of those metabolic issues that we may have. If we do have animals that are carrying twins that are requiring a higher amount, we may start to see some hypocalcemia or some milk fever issues, and potentially some grass tetany issues, depending on where we are at various times of the year. But understanding that these requirements tick up is critically important. And again, a very similar story as we look at some of these requirements, a little bit more nuanced with some of our trace minerals like selenium, but again, a similar story. And I'll show you some figures here in a moment. So now we're going to get into some more of the specific questions so that we can tailor this a little bit more. And this is where we all get to check our honesty a little bit. Again, if you're in the 250 to 300% range, I apologize. I'll send you a card in the mail. That's not something that I have the stomach for. But if you're hitting that 2 to 250 or 150 to 200 range, good for you. A lot of us in our country, our range flocks are probably closer to 100% lamb crop on a good year. So we do have some good diversity here, and I think this is reflective of maybe our operational size. But what I'm getting at here is if we do have a higher level of production, if we have a higher drop rate that approximates 200%, we need to keep in mind how those requirements are calculated. The fetal demand on some of those macro and micronutrients are really important to keep in mind based on our level of production. And I don't talk about this a lot, but I know that someone will have a question a little bit later asking me about what about mineral sources, chelated minerals versus sulfates and oxides. My recommendation has been that if we have the specialized level of production, or we have a specific objective where we're trying to maximize fiber growth, or we're trying to keep up with the rapid fetal growth and then milking and taking care of those twin or multiple lambs, then I do recommend that sometimes it's worth looking into a more bioavailable trace mineral source, like a chelated mineral. But oftentimes, if our level of production is not requiring that more bioavailable source, we don't always see a return on investment when spending money on more high dollar minerals. Okay, I'm going to move on there. So what about changing genetics? Why does this matter? I know that there may not be many Wyoming folks here today, but we've been conducting essential performance tests since the 1960s. And there was a study published in 2010 that kind of summarized how have sheep changed as we've selected and implemented some of these more phenotypic selection parameters. And what we saw was a 40-pound increase in the off-test weight. So rams were getting heavier. Obviously, they were getting bigger. We doubled our average daily gain, and as a result of that larger body size, we saw a 25% increase in fleece weight. Now, thinking back to what we talked about earlier about the level of production dictates the requirement for some of these minerals. It's no wonder that even in some of our Western states, as you, again, looking at this review study that we published recently, looking at some of our Western states and ewe prolificacy, again, 1.0 indicating 100% lamb crop or drop rate for the most part, you can see that we have increased over time. And so a mineral package or animals that could have thrived in the 70s based on those levels of production in a rangeland environment in Wyoming, or on an orchard grass pasture in Wisconsin, as we have selected and our body size has changed in our sheep and our level of production, so would we expect these trace minerals to increase as well. This is more of a aha kind of speculation type of a thought here, but you know, looking at some of our highly prolific breeds in the NRC's recommendations, we have yet, in my opinion, to truly refine trace mineral requirements for ewes that are commonly rearing, or sorry, gestating more than 3 lambs. These really prolific ewes, especially when we look at calcium and other vitamin D issues, I don't think we have a great handle on how we prevent some of these issues on sheep that are really at the highest level of production, especially in terms of prolificacy. Hopefully we will have answers in the next couple of years. I know that we talked a little bit about copper toxicity, talking a little bit about how breed differences exist in terms of mineral requirements and their response to increased mineral supplementation. It's pretty well documented that Texels are quite susceptible to copper toxicity. We have seen, even in selenium, increased growth performance in twin lambs that were given added levels of selenium above recommended NRC requirements, but not singles. And so we've seen, again, those animals that have a greater propensity for growth and performance oftentimes require a little bit more. More recently, we've looked at zinc. Again, we've really fixated on zinc, and we can visit some other time about why. But zinc utilization, we saw some really interesting differences in newborn lambs and ewes fed the same diet of black-faced terminal sire breeds, and then more of a fine wool type genotype. We saw greater transfer and concentrations of zinc in those newborn lambs and white-faced ewes. And again, we believe that goes back to their propensity for fiber growth. Zinc is a major constituent of wool production. And so breeding differences do exist. This is the point in the talk where I get to shy away from tough questions. I'll direct those to Todd. But what I do want to point out a little bit is that, you know, as we look at what works on our operation, working with good nutritionists that can help quantify our level of production and take that into account in our management system, that's an important consideration for trace mineral nutrition. I've alluded to this until I'm blue in the face, but I do want to highlight, this comes from some work we did at Oregon State University, looking at different selenium sources, so selenium yeast, sodium selenite, and looking at various levels of those. But we also had this control group that was drawn down in selenium. And really, as you can see, the way this graph is presented, those whole blood levels, that line on the top, you really start to see a major sink for selenium as those lambs start to grow inside that ewe, and especially in lactation. They use those nutrients, and if we're not providing them, we can start to see some of these issues manifest themselves. What about supercharging the newborn lamb? I know oftentimes I've talked a lot about prevention, and many of my students hear me talk about this a lot, but whether it be selenium or zinc, that initial consumption of colostrum is not only necessary for immune function and that protective immunity on a short-term basis, but also it's a rich cocktail of trace mineral and vitamins that really get that lamb off to a good start. I know many of us have speculated over the years that sometimes those lambs that don't make it, we can suspect that maybe the colostrum intake was pretty low, especially if we lose those lambs early on. But what if we could ensure that those animals and the colostrum they were getting was truly fortified with these necessary trace minerals until they got up on hard feed themselves? This graph on the left, again, of selenium shows what the effect of feeding those various levels of selenium was, an inorganic source on those 3 bars on the left, and a selenium yeast on the right. You can see that there was an effect by feeding more of it. It accumulated in the colostrum. And especially with the zinc work that we've done recently, you can kind of see the decline by half almost each day from day 0 to day 30. All right, so we're getting to the end of my questions and to the more practical aspects of this talk, okay? So again, asking everyone to be completely transparent. Select the choice which best describes your mineral supplementation program. I give 3 options, and maybe some of us are outliers, but in the mineral work we've done as we've worked with producers in our region, we've seen a range of a very strategic provision of a mineral on a consistent basis to, oh shoot, that mineral is hard as cement. I may need to change it out. I realize that all of us, depending, especially if we work off the farm or ranch, are probably all over that spectrum. Okay, so it looks like over half of us, roughly, are providing a free choice trace mineral, whether it's granular or a lick tub or block year round. That's great. That's great. That's the textbook recommendation, okay? I'm probably on the, I know what I'm supposed to do, but don't always accomplish it. A free choice trace mineral or block provided whenever I remember is about 21% of us. And then there's some of us that are clearly using a more TMR-based diet, which takes a lot of the trouble of variable consumption out of it. So I'm going to shift to that. So one of the challenges with any free choice mineral program is that there's a proportion of our ewes, whether they're in confinement or a dry lot or whether they're grazing a pasture, there will always be those that underconsume, that overconsume, and even some that never consume at all. And as we've looked at this data across, internationally in sheep production systems, it's all over the board. And I think one assumption that sometimes we erroneously make when it comes to mineral supplementation programs is if the mineral is out there, they're all getting it. Well, we know that sheep are unique creatures. There's some phobia of new feeders. There's some behavioral challenges that keep animals from coming to the bunk or the feed or the mineral trough like they should. But data internationally suggests that up to a third or even half of the ewe flock grazing are consuming less than what they should. And in other cases, they're consuming more what they should. The result of that is those overconsumers, it's expensive because generally there's not a whole lot of benefit for overconsuming a mineral. It's unnecessary. Those that are not consuming it at all are usually those 10 to 15% that manifest those issues that we don't always attribute back to a mineral deficiency, but may be a result of it. I think in our region, I've heard this quite a bit, and we've seen it ourselves. This comes out of some good work done at Montana State University from Devin Reagan and Jan Bowman up there. But they looked at mineral consumption, free choice mineral consumption in ounces per day in confinement and in on pasture. Now, the one thing that I'm sure of, because sheep will humble you on the regular in our profession, is that they don't know how to read a mineral tag very well. As you can see that dotted line at the bottom of this figure that says target intake. And again, this was probably a bit conservative for the mineral package that was being used, but it was about a 1/4 ounce per day. And as you can see in this particular experiment, very few consumed that target amount. That image on the left in 2010 showed that one of those ewes did. My point is not to scare us into saying that sheep are going to eat us out of house and home when it comes to mineral, but target intake and what animals are supposed to eat versus what they do eat are things that we need to keep an eye on. And I'll show you some simplistic ways to kind of keep an eye on that and do some rough math here in a minute.
Whit, there was a question just come in. Is that data true for minerals mixed into salt? I'm assuming that that's a complete mineral mix that you were looking at there.
Yeah, that is a complete mineral mix. So it would have a component of sodium chloride in it. Maybe not as much as a premix, but yeah, that was a complete granular mineral and then a block mineral. So what about those that are not consuming? Why are they not consuming? And again, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone a little bit. I have not been to the Great Lakes since I left Western New York a long time ago, especially in the sheep production realm. But there are various reasons, and these are some of them, and there may be more that you all have seen, and I'd love to hear some of those reasons. But these are oftentimes some of the reasons why we may not be seeing that adequate consumption. I know on rangelands here, on large grazing allotments with bands, logistically, when you have 1,500 to 2,000 ewes grazing a large area, it is tough to expect those animals all to make it to the mineral feeder with consistency. And in those instances where logistically it's just hard to deliver it and we're having a hard time seeing them consume it, we recommend in our area on range flocks to fortify the pellet, fortify your alfalfa pellet or your protein supplement and deliver it that way, as the animals are much more incentivized to consume that. But we've also seen, how many times have you noticed that your mineral feeder got flipped open, or it's been out there a long time and it just got weathered to the extent that it was just unpalatable? Okay, that is a real challenge. And not only is it unpalatable to the animal, but that kind of weathering can really change the mineral composition and the interactions of that mineral and really reduce its absorption in the animal when it's consumed. Ways to maybe move it closer to a water source. We know all sheep need to come to water eventually, except in our region where snow can also suffice. There may also be some social interactions. And people laugh when I talk about this, but there's been an interesting body of work looking at what happens when we put the mineral feeder out with the ewe lamb pairs prior to weaning. And it showed almost a 50% increase of lambs that were watching their mothers consume that mineral and getting a chance at it before weaning that actually continued to consume that mineral on a regular basis once they went into the barn. So there's a lot of different factors that affect it. And I think this is where the art and science of sheep production comes in. And those of you listening know that you are the masters of the art of sheep production, and being willing to look at some of these things and diagnose why they may not be consuming a mineral is important. So what if our sheep are over-consuming? And this is not just for overconsumption. This helps us keep on budget with what we are expending in a mineral. Now, I'm going to use some assumptions here that may not fit your exact operation, but again, the math should translate, okay? So I'm using a high target intake of 1.5 ounces per ewe per day, okay? You're probably shaking your head saying, I can't afford to feed my ewe that much. Well, I'm a realist and assuming that there is some overconsumption happening. The way that we can determine that, what the target intake should be, or what they're currently consuming, is the feed provided in ounces divided by the number of days that it should last times the number of ewes. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of this math real quick. So let's just assume we're a farm flock with 80 ewes. Okay, we don't want to be out there all the time, so we put 2 bags of mineral in the mineral feeder. That's 100 pounds. Okay, roughly 1,600 ounces. Okay. We want it to last 7 days for those 80 ewes. Well, we want it to last longer than that, but we see that these ewes, when we see that it's only lasting about 7 days across 80 ewes, they're eating about 3 ounces per ewe per day. And believe it or not, they can consume that much mineral. So why would they be consuming that much? There's flavoring agents that could stimulate intake. Obviously, there's important carriers that make sure that the blend works as it should in a granular mineral. But those animals are not necessarily wise enough to know what they should be eating in terms of their requirements. Okay, so in this instance, we were hoping that these ewes would last a lot longer with this amount of mineral, but they overconsumed. And so my recommendation, and there may be nutritionists listening that disagree, but if this is a period where the ewes are in late lactation, they're out on grass, they're not milking much anymore, this is an example where if they ate 7 days worth of mineral or 10 days worth of mineral in 2 days, I don't put another bag out for another 8 days. One important aspect is that a lot of these minerals are stored in the liver. They're transported in the serum and other transport proteins in the body, but there's often very little benefit to overfeeding minerals beyond the requirement, with some exception. And we'll talk about that, especially with selenium. But this can allow us to calculate what the animal should be eating, how close to the target intake they're eating, and help us stay on budget. Let me just mention really quick, because I get this question a lot and I didn't prepare a specific slide for it, and I'm quickly running out of time here. What are my thoughts on a molasses type lick tub? And I've caught a lot of heat for this, so I'm going to gingerly tiptoe around this a little bit. I think if we're feeding a lick tub for a macronutrient like protein, I question its economic value and the ability of that animal to consume enough to really make up for those protein requirements at drastic production periods. And I know I'm going to take heat for this, but let me say this, there's some convenience issues. There's some grazing distribution issues. There's other reasons. So it's not just an economical approach, But why I do really like mineral tubs or lick tubs that have a high degree of molasses or other good flavoring agents is we can really minimize that variation in consumption. I think that when we have that enticing of a mineral carrier out there, our non-consumers and our low consumers is drastically reduced. So I'm throwing that out there. I know I'll get some questions at the end, but I get this question often. So let's just talk a little bit about how we could keep some of these mineral costs in line, okay? I put a very simplistic example up here, and depending on your production calendar, it can be changed. But I look at a year-round supplementation approach where sometimes we fall short for various logistic reasons or keeping a mineral out there or grazing systems. Roughly speaking, this is about a $1,100 a ton mineral package, 365 days times an ounce per head per day. That could be about $14 per ewe per year. Now, I know people are paying less and some more than this, but let's contrast that just for a relative description here of a targeted approach where we prioritize those periods of breeding, pre-weaning, gestation, lactation, and really focus our efforts those times of the year. There's some significant savings to be had. And the gold standard is always make sure you keep whites out year round. But I'm a realist in knowing that at least in Western sheep production systems, that is not always done. And so I think a good alternative is targeting those time points when those animals really need it the most, which I've talked about exhaustively tonight. I promised Todd that I would provide a Wisconsin type example looking at what is provided in the basal parts of the diet. This is a very simplistic diet. This is not going to satisfy those of you that are using a complex TMR ration, but this just illustrates a little bit about how we can approach looking at our basal diets for what they provide. I use Sheep Bites ration balancing program. I'm a big fan of it. There's other ones out there. But basically what I try to show us here a little bit is those blocks in red or green. Red would indicate that we're in excess or we may be in a shortfall. Those in green say that we're probably okay. In this particular diet that I'm throwing up here, it's just a haylage, a free choice alfalfa grass haylage with a pound of corn top dressed. My assumptions on the animal side are these are the last third of pregnancy or the last 6 weeks. It's about 170-pound ewe carrying twins and making a broad assumption that she can eat 3% of her body weight, which we could argue a little bit later. What I'm trying to show here is that the shortfalls, especially when we look at zinc and selenium and iodine, oftentimes our basal diets get pretty darn close, with exception. And when we have the ability to supplement with a free choice trace mineral or blend that into a TMR diet, meeting these requirements does not take a whole lot of creativity. And this is where I give a shout out to a lot of our private industry mineral manufacturers, is that unless this is just your generic mineral that you'd buy at Tractor Supply, well, I shouldn't name a particular company, at a feed store that doesn't have a whole lot of specialization for sheep production, chances are if it's a cookie cutter mineral, there could be some room for improvement. I've seen that with zinc concentrations. But for the most part, when we do provide that supplemental mineral, we're able to make up some of that shortfall in mineral composition. You can see in this example, we are about 10 milligrams short in zinc. We were quite short in selenium, which is one of the reasons we need to make sure that the mineral has selenium. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is most diets, especially of higher quality, we can meet those requirements relatively easily. It's important to understand with selenium, and I'm talking about this because it's important in Wisconsin especially, that we have FDA regulations that really limit and regulate our ability to fortify a mineral with selenium. I think it's worth noting that as we better understand selenium nutrition over time, from the 1981 NRC, which is the nutritional recommendations textbook, we went from about 0.1 milligrams per kilogram to 0.3. I would expect that we will continue to see these recommendations refined, but as you work with your nutritionists, understand that many of them, they cannot defy some of these federal regulations for various reasons, and selenium is definitely one of those. I am going to throw this out there because I think this is one of the restrictions that we have in our area. There's a perception that everything is adequate in selenium and we don't have selenium deficiency in the West. We absolutely do, especially in our Wyoming. And if you only have a mineral that's fortified at about 20 milligrams or 20 parts per million versus a 90 parts per million mineral package, you can see that 20 parts per million product doesn't meet requirements, even if you are consuming a lot of mineral. And so I highly recommend making sure that if you are in a selenium deficient region, that you are working with a premix or a company that is fortifying to that maximum allowed amount. Last question, as we move into the last 3 slides. And I know you're gonna pull me off of the shepherd's crook here, Todd, because I'm almost to the hour. But I wanna know, when was the last time you analyzed pasture or hay for mineral composition on your operation?
Don't worry about me pulling your plug. It's the ladies that might. Do
Okay,
that.
all right. I promise I'm almost done. Okay, so this is really interesting to me. And I think there's multiple reasons. It's not because we don't want to, it's finding a good lab we trust. There's some costs associated with it, but it looks like over 63% of us have never tested for minerals in our pasture or hay. And I would even say feedstuffs. Maybe I should have included that too if you're working with the TMR ration. About 17% every 5 years, and only about 20% of us do it every year. I think it's important that we archive those results. It's really reactive for us just to take 1 year's results and then say, oh, I'm going to overhaul my mineral program. Consistent sampling, whether it be every year, every other year, for less than $50, we can answer a lot of questions about what may be happening from a mineral nutrition standpoint. Here's some various options for you. Again, I'm not promoting one over the other. We use Word Lab simply because they're close and they've been good to work with. I just want to remind us that precision programs are based on testing your feeds and forages. That is precision at its finest. Textbook values, we know that there's variation, especially with our byproducts and other feedstuffs, but especially within season for grasses. And I won't bore you with some of the work we've done quantifying what minerals look like in different grasses and shrub species here, but not all grasses or shrubs are created equal when it comes to providing a more complete mineral package. I'd also encourage you all, if you do feed a lot of byproducts, there's a good resource from North Dakota State University. There's probably others out there. It's really, really important to test byproducts. The level of variation that we see, especially with trace minerals and byproducts, are pretty pronounced. And so it's important that we definitely test those if we're integrating those into a ration. I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. I want to conclude with these thoughts, and then I'm happy to take some questions if we can go over a little bit. I've already talked about when to prioritize these minerals. I just strongly believe, based on the literature and our experience, that these time points are when we get the most bang for our buck. Familiarizing those lambs with the mineral feeder. We see this a lot in our large rain flocks. They get back to the Front Range of Colorado to be fed out, and it's a hard challenge getting them bunk broke and getting them settled in. We can reduce some of that neophobia, or that, afraid of anything new, by getting some of these products out there and getting animals used to them before we wean them. Placing this mineral package next to water, especially for having a hard time getting them to consume it, but also for your own ease of monitoring. The human element, we are all busy. We are not perfect. And sometimes it's really hard for us to stay on top of making sure, amidst all the other responsibilities on a sheep enterprise, that we have a mineral out there, but it's really important. And lastly, I just encourage us to test our minerals. I'm happy to take some questions. Again, I'm going to deflect the hard ones to Todd, Carolyn, Ashley, Lisa, and then I'll take all the easy ones.
I'll start you off with one that I think I know the answer to, but I'll let you touch base on it. I had a question come in a bit ago. Is there a benefit to providing individual minerals versus a complete or a mixed mineral mix? I know in this area, there's some people that believe that they can try to, put out a mineral buffet, and I don't know as if that's the most cost-effective way to do it, but.
Yeah, so I'm just going to speak from the science perspective and published literature. There's not good evidence to say that the cafeteria system is an effective way to meet those requirements. Now, I know there's folks that swear by it, so I don't want to discredit their advice, but from a scientific basis, it's really hard for an animal to know, I'm carrying 2 lambs and I might have weak lambs if I don't tank up on some of this iodized salt. So I think nutritional wisdom is something that I'm quite skeptical of on certain trace minerals when it comes to sheep.
Okay. Another question, and I don't know, Whit, you can touch base on this one, but we also have a grazing expert and a forage expert on the webinar tonight that might want to touch base on this. I see Woody Lane is on tonight. So there was a question come in, is there a certain time of year that we should be testing grasses or test during critical periods like breeding, lambing, etc.?
Well, I'm happy to deflect to Woody. Woody's a great resource, but I will say that with the viewers tuning in tonight, there's a vast diversity of folks whose production calendars are not going to be the same. And so I would test forages in advance of those large production events. So if we're kicking out onto grass in May and we're skeptical whether those ewes are going to have enough magnesium or they're going to have enough energy, we would probably want to test then. I don't find a whole lot of utility in testing always. Well, I might deflect this one for now, but I will say that it should match your production calendar, and it should be done enough in advance that can inform your management to make an intervention. It's really hard to do a test and extrapolate how much protein's in your grass after those really critically demanding time points.
Good. Another question I see coming in here at the end, can palatability of loose minerals be improved somehow?
Yeah, so palatability issues as a result of weathering and caking, I don't think can be remediated. I don't have a good way of saying, yeah, you can fluff it back up and it'll be just as good as when it came out of the bag. I think a lot of the feed companies and private industry that we've worked with have really refined these flavoring agents, which really incentivize consumption. If we're using a product that consistently is lower in intake, you might look at what's happening in the larger diet. I know in our region, in green up periods from May and June, it's just really hard to get an animal to get to the mineral feeder. There's just too much attractive ingredients, especially when they've been fighting the winter here in rangeland country. So I would say that if you consistently see palatability issues, I would talk with whoever is providing you that mineral package to look at if there's some other issues going on.
Here's another good question that just came in, and this is kind of along your targeting, production cycle and when to offer these minerals. How long does it take for the body to absorb or be able to utilize these minerals? So if we target graze, or if we target feed, how long do we need to kind of give them a warm up, or if we target peak times soon before these peak times, do we need to start, or how soon do we need to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. We cannot expect our animals to respond to a better mineral package within 2 days. I mean, for the most part, I think it's important that we look at targeting breeding season 2 to 3 weeks in advance, right? Getting it out there ahead of time, sustaining that supplementation throughout that critical early period of pregnancy when that ewe loses the majority of her pregnancies and has to recognize it. So doing it in advance of these production events, at least 2 to 3 weeks prior, I think is a good strategy moving forward. We can't do it within days and expect it to just work. Great question. Great question.
Drew just made another good comment too. Thank you, Whit. It's definitely interesting, the difference from east to west in terms of sheep raising, and I think mineral supplementation is even probably more critical and more drastic from east coast to west coast, just because of the difference in the environment.
As our dairy sheep is growing in Wisconsin, do you have any information or a mineral requirement table for our dairy breeds?
You know, on a good day, I could be a bad dairy nutritionist. I think when we're dealing with lactating rations and those other aspects, I would say that it requires a greater degree of precision. One that I really like, and I know this is very cliche for me to pull out a textbook, but I'm a big fan of this Dairy Sheep Nutrition Handbook. I use this a lot, especially for some of our issues with poor milking ewes in some of our shed lambing systems. For other energy and protein type nutrition questions. But I think it's important as we look at a sustained lactation, especially with dairy sheep, that our mineral package really needs high quality attention from a good dairy nutritionist. I won't say just a dairy nutritionist, but some of the principles and the understanding that we have from the dairy nutrition world have much better translation than those of us working in a range sheep nutrition background. But I'm a big fan of that dairy sheep nutrition text. And I think looking at the sink that we see those mineral losses to that are shuttled into the milk and how those are greater early on in lactation, I think it's important that we are even more attentive to our mineral nutrition with dairy rations. So I'm skirting around the question, but I think that's where you really need to make sure that you're working with a nutritionist that you trust.
You did better on that one than I would have, Whit. I'm in a state that's supposed to know what they're doing when feeding dairy sheep, but I don't. So question came in, and this may be more towards their veterinarian to give them this answer. Should we take postmortem liver samples for laboratory mineral analysis?
Oh, that is a very good question. Yeah, I should preface that, you know, a lot of the work that we talk about looking at serum and whole blood values, for certain minerals, that's just not going to be a great diagnostic tool. And we acknowledge that. I think it's a really good strategy to look at serum looking at the liver mineral element profile at a diagnostic lab pretty regularly. I think it's more informative in our neck of the woods to look at some of those trace mineral status and coal use that kind of give us an idea coming off of some of these challenging landscapes or these challenging production periods where their shortfalls might be. But absolutely, submitting a liver biopsy or a liver sample postmortem is critically informative, I think, on our operations.
Good. Do you see any additional products helping in mineral or in a mineral such as Bovatec, humic, yeast, et cetera?
So those additives do definitely have value. There's a lot of products out there. I will say that, again, targeting those to those physiologically demanding time points is probably the best recommendation. I will say yes, if there's data to substantiate it. Some of the yeast products indicate that there's some benefit there. I just think about the level of pathogens that in a shed lambing system that these lambs are up against, the wet spring months. I think a good investment in those products, if they've been proven to be beneficial, are during those time points. And that I would also be wary sometimes also that understanding that sometimes, believe it or not, some products are sold or pushed that may not do what they say it does. And I know that not all of us have access to an academic library to search that. But again, that's where I think Extension, doing a pitch for Extension, we don't have any money to be made by telling you to feed a certain product or another. We have access to those resources. So I would encourage you to reach out to those folks in Extension or at your land grant institution to get to the bottom of some of those things, or a nutritionist if you really have a great one.
Yeah, I think this next question is kind of along those same lines. What about the use of mineral paste supplements or shots? When is it appropriate and or beneficial to use those over a mineral packet, I guess?
Yeah, you obviously can eliminate some of the variation in intake, right? When you're providing a shot or a drench like they use in some of the Southern Hemisphere. You know, I think we don't have great access to the formulation of those drenches, some of the pastes we do. I think for newborn lambs, if we're not sure the quality of the colostrum was any good from the ewe, that some of those pastes, those drenches for the lambs might be beneficial. I know they're highly effective in New Zealand, you know, their dewormers that they use are often fortified with their trace minerals. So we do know it works, but the availability of those products in our country are much more limited. So injectable sources, at least with selenium anyways, we don't see the retention in the tissues as long. The storage is not as great. And so that's where going back to looking at various mineral sources, some of those chelated sources that are stored differently in the tissue for longer amounts of time might be beneficial as well.
And that you kind of touched on one of the next questions coming up here is BOC shots. Is it necessary to give every lamb a shot, or is it recommended? I know in our country, pretty much everybody uses a BOC injectable shot to lambs.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you to stop doing that. That's for sure. I will say if we've been providing a good selenium enriched mineral and we've got good data to substantiate that, if the levels are adequate for the ewe, you can guarantee that selenium is going to be shuttled across the placenta and through the colostrum. So I think the greatest insurance, because again, that is the best insurance we have, even from a vaccination standpoint, is that last third of pregnancy, making sure that we provide that protection. I think a very good sound mineral program late gestation, great disclaimer, could eventually potentially replace that shot, but I'm too much of a conservative, been humbled too many times to say, no, I'm not going to tell you to stop doing it. Because that's what we did in Western New York. That is a common protocol in selenium deficient areas. And with the price of lambs, I'd be darned if I suggested otherwise.
Any more questions quick? Appreciate everybody filling out this eval here at the end, giving us some feedback on what you learned from Whit.
Yeah, and thank you for your patience. I think that's the beauty that we all enjoy in the sheep industry. We're passionate about what we raise, but very different production dynamics. And I hope some of these principles, what I've tried to address today, do have overlap no matter where you are running sheep. And if we take these principles and apply them to our production systems, I think we can have a more strategic mineral supplementation program. So thanks for having me. It's been an honor.